Chapter 1. A Perfect Sky. September 11th, 2001, New York City. The day began with a sky of impossible, searing blue. It was a Tuesday. In the final fleeting moments of a world that was about to vanish, the city hummed with the familiar rhythm of a late summer morning. The air was crisp, cool, a welcome reprieve from the humidity that had choked the 5 boroughs for weeks. It was the kind of morning that felt like a promise, a fresh start. In Lower Manhattan, the twin titans of the World Trade Center, the North and South Towers, caught the first rays of the rising sun. Their immense glass and steel facades reflected the flawless azure expanse above, standing as they always had, symbols of American ambition, commerce, and unshakable permanence. Below them, streets filled with the orchestrated chaos of the morning commute. Yellow cabs darted through traffic, the hiss of bus brakes, the distant siren, the murmur of a million lives beginning their day. It was a city waking up, utterly oblivious. It was 7:59 a.m., Eastern Daylight Time. In Boston, at Logan International Airport, American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, bound for Los Angeles, pushed back from the gate. On board were 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, and 2 pilots. Among the passengers were 5 men who had no intention of reaching California. Their leader, a 33-year-old Egyptian named Mohamed Atta, sat in business class, seat 8D. He had spent the previous night in a hotel in Portland, Maine, a seemingly insignificant detail that would later be scrutinized for its baffling logic. To the other passengers, he and his 4 companions would have been unremarkable, just another group of men on another cross-country flight. The routines of air travel were in full motion. Flight attendants performed their safety demonstrations. The captain, John Oganowski, a veteran pilot and a farmer from Massachusetts, guided the massive aircraft into the sky, climbing into that perfect blue. For 14 minutes, Flight 11 was just another airplane, a blip on a radar screen, one of thousands crisscrossing the nation. The passengers settled in. Some read newspapers, others sipped coffee. They were business travelers, families on vacation, people heading home. They were living the last normal moments of their lives, suspended between the earth and a sky that held no hint of the violence to come. The world was still whole, but the plan, a meticulously crafted vision of destruction years in the making, was already in motion. The hijackers were not just men on a plane, they were the leading edge of a historical rupture, the physical manifestation of a hatred that had been festering for decades in distant lands. Their mission was not just to kill, but to shatter symbols, to bring a superpower to its knees by turning its own modern marvels against itself. As Flight 11 climbed to its cruising altitude, the first critical phase of their operation began. At 8:13 a.m., the pilots made their last routine communication with air traffic control. Everything was normal. Seconds later, it was not. The transponder, a device that broadcasts the plane's identity and altitude, was switched off. The aircraft, now a ghost, vanished from the controller's screens. On the ground, in the Boston Air Route Traffic Control Center, a controller named Peter Zalewski stared at his screen in disbelief. One moment, the icon for American 11 was there. The next, it was gone. This was not supposed to happen. It was a minor anomaly, perhaps a technical glitch. But it was the first tear in the fabric of the morning. At the same time, another Boeing 767, United Airlines Flight 175, was also pushing back from its gate at Logan, also bound for Los Angeles. And at Newark International Airport, United Airlines Flight 93, a Boeing 757 headed for San Francisco, was beginning its boarding process. From Dulles International Airport outside Washington, D.C., American Airlines Flight 77, another 757 bound for Los Angeles, was also preparing for departure. 4 planes, 19 hijackers, thousands of souls. The components of the attack were moving into place, a constellation of doom converging on the unsuspecting eastern seaboard. The hijackers on Flight 11 had made their move, using box cutters and the threat of a bomb they did not have. They breached the cockpit. The struggle would have been brief, brutal, and terrifying. The precise details are lost to history, but the outcome was absolute. By 8:21 a.m., the hijackers had full control of the aircraft. They were flying a 200-ton guided missile, and they were turning it south toward the glittering skyline of New York City. On the ground, confusion was mounting. Air traffic controllers in Boston tried desperately to re-establish contact with Flight 11. Their calls went unanswered. Then, something chilling happened. A controller heard a voice coming through the radio frequency, not a pilot's, but a calm, accented voice speaking in English. It was Mohamed Atta, mistakenly broadcasting his message intended for the passengers. He said, "We have some planes, just stay quiet, and you'll be okay. We are returning to the airport." A moment later, another transmission. "Nobody move, everything will be okay. If you try to make any moves, you'll endanger yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet." The controllers in Boston now knew this was not a technical problem. This was a hijacking. The word itself felt archaic, a relic of a different era. Hijackings were something that happened in the 1970s, usually ending with a landing in Cuba and a political statement. The protocol was to get the plane on the ground safely. But this felt different. The silence from the cockpit, the strange transmissions, the plane's deliberate southerly turn off its designated flight path. A sense of dread, cold and sharp, began to permeate the control room. The established procedures seemed suddenly inadequate, designed for a world that, unbeknownst to them, no longer existed. They notified the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters. They debated whether to contact the military. In the intricate, rule-bound world of civilian air traffic control, the idea of shooting down a commercial airliner was not just unthinkable, it was outside the realm of imagination. While Boston scrambled to understand the unfolding crisis, the passengers and crew aboard Flight 11 were living a nightmare. Flight attendant Betty Ong, with astonishing composure, managed to make a call to an American Airlines reservation center. For over 20 minutes, she relayed crucial information from the back of the plane. Her voice, calm but strained, provided the first real-time account of the new face of terror. She reported the cockpit was unreachable, that 2 of her colleagues had been stabbed, that a passenger in business class had his throat slit. She gave the hijackers seat numbers. She was a voice from inside the abyss, a profile in courage in the face of unimaginable horror. Her call, and another made by fellow flight attendant Madeline Sweeney, gave the world its first terrible glimpse into the hijackers' methods and their ruthlessness. They were not negotiating. They were not making demands. They were on a one-way mission. The city of New York, meanwhile, continued its morning rituals. In the North Tower of the World Trade Center, thousands of workers were arriving. They poured out of the subway, grabbed coffee, and rode the express elevators to their offices in the sky. They worked in finance, in law, in insurance. They were traders, secretaries, janitors, executives. At the top, in the windows on the World Restaurant on the 106th and 107th floors, staff were preparing for the day's events. The views were breathtaking. You could see for 50 miles in every direction. It felt like being on top of the world. At 8:46 a.m. From those windows, some may have seen it coming. A large passenger jet, flying impossibly low, impossibly fast, screaming over the Hudson River. It wasn't turning. It wasn't climbing. It was descending, aimed directly at them for those on the streets below. The sight was surreal, confusing. A flash of silver, the roar of engines growing from a hum to a deafening thunderclap. It was too low. Something was terribly wrong. People stopped and pointed, their faces a mixture of curiosity and alarm. And then, in a fraction of a second, the promise of the morning was annihilated. American Airlines Flight 11, traveling at over 460 miles per hour, slammed into the northern face of the North Tower, striking between the 93rd and 99th floors. The impact was catastrophic. A brilliant, blossoming fireball of jet fuel erupted from the building, a violent orange against the placid blue sky. A shockwave rolled across lower Manhattan, rattling windows for miles. The building shuddered on its foundations, a deep, groaning tremor felt by everyone inside. A plume of black smoke began to pour from a gaping wound in the tower's side, a scar on the face of the skyline. The world had just witnessed an act of mass murder, but for a few crucial moments, no one understood what they had seen. Was it an accident? A terrible, tragic accident, involving a small private plane? The scale of the aircraft was hard to comprehend from the ground. News channels broke into their regular programming with live shots of the smoking tower. Anchors spoke with uncertainty, speculating about a navigational error. But in the control rooms of the FAA and the cockpits of other pilots, a horrifying realization was dawning. They had heard Atta's transmissions. They knew it was a hijacked 767. This was no accident. And as they absorbed that first shock, they became aware of a second developing crisis. United Airlines Flight 175, the other 767 out of Boston, had also stopped communicating. Its transponder had been turned off, and it too was heading for New York City. The perfect morning was over. A new and terrible age had begun, born in fire and smoke under a perfect blue sky. The first tower was burning, and the second plane was coming. The worst was yet to come. Chapter 2. The Long Fuse. The explosion that ripped through the North Tower on September 11th was not a spontaneous event. It was the culmination of a long and winding fuse, lit years earlier and half a world away, in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Saudi Arabia. To understand the fire that bloomed over Manhattan, one must trace this fuse back to its source, to a complex web of history, ideology, and personal grievance that coalesced into a global jihadist movement with the United States as its principal target. The story begins, in many ways, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. This conflict became a pivotal moment for the Islamic world. The Soviet Union, an atheist superpower, had invaded a Muslim country, sparking a call to arms that resonated far and wide. From across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond, thousands of young Muslim men traveled to Afghanistan to join the Mujahideen, the holy warriors fighting to expel the invaders. They were funded and armed, ironically, by the United States through the CIA's Operation Cyclone as part of a Cold War strategy to bleed the Soviets. Among these foreign fighters was a young, wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. Born into the billionaire bin Laden family, which had deep ties to the Saudi royal court, he was an unlikely revolutionary. He was quiet, pious, and seemingly destined for a life of privilege within the kingdom's construction empire. But the Afghan war changed him. He saw the fight not just as a nationalist struggle, but as a defense of Islam itself. He used his immense personal fortune and family connections to establish the Maktab al-Khadamat, or Services Office, which recruited, transported, and financed Arab fighters for the Afghan jihad. In Afghanistan, bin Laden and his fellow Arab fighters proved to be effective. They gained battlefield experience, learned guerrilla tactics, and forged powerful bonds, united by a shared sense of religious purpose. They saw the eventual Soviet withdrawal in 1989, not as a victory for American foreign policy, but as a testament to the power of faith. They believed that they, a small band of devout warriors, had defeated a superpower. This belief instilled in them a profound sense of confidence, even arrogance. If they could defeat one superpower, why not another? After the Soviets left, Afghanistan descended into civil war, and the Arab fighters, their purpose fulfilled, began to disperse. Bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia a hero, but he was a changed man, radicalized by his experience, and deeply concerned about the direction of the Muslim world. It was at this time that he founded a new organization, a more formal and militant group to carry on the jihad. He called it Al-Qaeda, which translates to the base. It was initially conceived as a database of the veteran Arab Afghans, a network that could be called upon for future conflicts. The next major catalyst came in 1990, when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United States, fearing for the stability of the region and its oil supply, launched Operation Desert Shield. Hundreds of thousands of American troops poured into Saudi Arabia, the land of Islam's holiest sites, Mecca and Medina. For bin Laden, this was a profound betrayal. The idea of infidel armies stationed on sacred soil was anathema to his puritanical Wahhabi interpretation of Islam. He had offered the services of his veteran Mujahideen to the Saudi royal family to defend the kingdom, an offer that was politely refused in favor of American military might. This rejection and the subsequent presence of U.S. troops radicalized him further. He saw the Saudi monarchy as corrupt and subservient to the West, and he began to openly criticize the regime. His dissent made him a pariah. In 1992 he was exiled from Saudi Arabia and relocated to Sudan, which was then under the rule of an Islamist government. From his new base in Khartoum, bin Laden began to build Al-Qaeda into a global terrorist organization. He established businesses as fronts, set up training camps, and began to articulate a clear ideology. His primary enemy was no longer the far enemies of the Soviets, but the near enemies, the corrupt regimes in the Middle East, and the far enemies that propped them up, the United States. He viewed America's presence in the Middle East, its support for Israel, and its economic sanctions against Iraq as a declaration of war against Islam. It was during this period that Al-Qaeda's operational capabilities grew. A key figure who joined bin Laden was Ayman al-Zawahiri, an Egyptian doctor and leader of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Zawahiri was the intellectual architect of the movement, providing the theological justification for a global jihad against America. Together, they transformed Al-Qaeda from a regional network into a transnational threat. The first tremors of this new threat were felt in America on February 26, 1993. A massive truck bomb, built by a group of conspirators linked to a radical blind sheikh, was detonated in the parking garage beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The explosion killed 6 people and injured over 1,000. The plot's mastermind, Ramzi Youssef, had trained in an Al-Qaeda camp in Afghanistan. His stated goal was to topple the North Tower into the South Tower, killing tens of thousands. The attack failed in its grand ambition, but it was a chilling dress rehearsal. It demonstrated that foreign terrorists could strike at the heart of America, and it placed the World Trade Center for the first time in the crosshairs of jihadist ideology. For bin Laden, the 1993 bombing was a sign of what was possible. Throughout the mid-1990s, al-Qaeda's attacks grew bolder. They were linked to the killing of U.S. soldiers in Somalia in 1993, an event dramatized in Black Hawk Down. In 1996, under pressure from the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, Sudan expelled bin Laden. He returned to Afghanistan, a failed state now under the control of the Taliban, a brutish, ultra-conservative Islamist movement. The Taliban provided him with a safe haven, and in return bin Laden provided them with funding and fighters. From his new sanctuary, bin Laden escalated his war. In February 1998, he and Zawahiri issued a fatwa, a religious edict, under the banner of the World Islamic Front for Jihad against Jews and Crusaders. It declared that it was the individual duty of every Muslim to kill Americans, both military and civilian, anywhere in the world. This was a terrifying escalation. It erased the distinction between combatant and non-combatant, and it gave a religious license for mass murder. 6 months later, al-Qaeda made good on its threat. On August 7, 1998, massive, synchronized truck bombs exploded outside the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The blasts killed 224 people, including 12 Americans, and wounded thousands. The attacks were a demonstration of al-Qaeda's global reach and its sophisticated operational planning. The Clinton administration responded with cruise missile strikes on al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and a suspected chemical weapons facility in Sudan. The strikes, codenamed Operation Infinite Reach, missed bin Laden and were widely criticized in the Muslim world as an overreaction. For al-Qaeda, they were a propaganda victory, proof that they could strike the superpower and draw its fire. The fuse was burning shorter. The American intelligence community was now acutely aware of the threat posed by bin Laden, but they struggled to grasp the full scope of his ambitions. They viewed al-Qaeda through the traditional lens of a state-sponsored terrorist group, not as the non-state, ideologically driven global network it had become. The next major attack came on October 12, 2000. In the port of Aden, Yemen, a small boat packed with explosives pulled alongside the USS Cole, a billion-dollar American guided missile destroyer that was refueling. The resulting explosion ripped a 40 by 60-foot hole in the side of the ship, killing 17 U.S. sailors and injuring 39. The attack was audacious and meticulously planned. It showed that al-Qaeda could strike even heavily armed U.S. military targets. By the dawn of the new millennium, the conflict had been escalating for over a decade. It was a shadow war, fought with bombs and intelligence, largely invisible to the American public. Bin Laden had declared war on the United States multiple times, but his declarations were not taken with the gravity they deserved. He was often dismissed as a fringe extremist, a cave-dwelling fanatic with grandiose delusions. But within his organization, a new, even more ambitious plot was already taking shape. It was known as the Plains Operation. The idea had been conceived by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or KSM, the uncle of the 1993 WTC bomber Ramzi Youssef. KSM was al-Qaeda's master operational planner, a man with a diabolical imagination and a deep understanding of Western vulnerabilities. He presented the idea to bin Laden in Afghanistan in 1999. The plan was breathtaking in its scale and barbarity. Hijack multiple American airliners and fly them into iconic American landmarks. The targets were carefully chosen for their symbolic value: the World Trade Center, representing American economic power; the Pentagon, representing American military power; and either the White House or the U.S. Capitol, representing American political power. Bin Laden approved the plan enthusiastically. He selected the lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta, and handpicked the other members of the muscle teams. These men were then sent to the West to learn to blend in, to obtain pilot licenses, and to prepare for their suicide mission. The long fuse that was lit in the mountains of Afghanistan had now crossed oceans. It was inside America's borders, carried by men who looked like students or tourists, men who were living in American suburbs, eating in American diners, and training in American flight schools. They were hiding in plain sight, patiently waiting for the signal to complete their mission. The history of grievance, the years of radicalization, the escalating cycle of attacks and reprisals, it had all led to this. The coming storm was not a bolt from the blue. It was the inevitable destination of a journey that had begun 2 decades earlier. The world just hadn't been watching closely enough. And as the year 2001 progressed, the fuse burned down to its final inches, ready to ignite a conflagration that would consume the old world and forge a new one in its place. Chapter 3. The system was blinking red. In the spring and summer of 2001, the United States was a nation at peace, enjoying a period of unrivaled prosperity and global influence. The Cold War was a memory. The economy was strong, and the primary concerns of the new administration under President George W. Bush were domestic issues like tax cuts and education reform. But beneath this placid surface, the nation's intelligence and security agencies were grappling with a rising tide of threat intelligence related to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. The threat indicators were disjointed, fragmented, and spread across multiple, often competing agencies. They were pieces of a puzzle that were never assembled. In the aftermath, the 9/11 Commission would famously conclude, the system was blinking red. But at the time, no single person had a clear view of the entire terrifying picture. The warnings began to intensify in the early months of the year. The CIA, led by Director George Tenet, was particularly focused on the al-Qaeda threat. Tenet would later say that his own hair was on fire over the issue. His agency was picking up a significant increase in threat chatters from al-Qaeda communications. The intercepts were alarming, but maddeningly vague. They spoke of a big events being planned, something that would have very big repercussions. But they offered no specifics on the timing, location, or method of the attack. It was a signal surrounded by noise. The intelligence community was facing a challenge it was ill-equipped to handle. The CIA and the FBI, the nation's premier foreign and domestic intelligence agencies, were separated by a legal and cultural wall. The CIA was barred from operating domestically, and the FBI was focused on law enforcement, building criminal cases after a crime had been committed, not preventing attacks before they happened. Information sharing between the two agencies was poor, hampered by bureaucracy, turf wars, and outdated technology. This structural flaw would prove to be catastrophic. One of the most significant missed opportunities centered on two veteran al-Qaeda operatives, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. These were not foot soldiers. They were experienced jihadists who had fought in Bosnia and were personally known to bin Laden. In January 2000, the CIA tracked them to a key al-Qaeda planning meeting in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The agency knew they were dangerous. They even knew that al-Mihdhar had a US visa in his passport. Yet, inexplicably, the CIA failed to place them on the State Department's watch list, which would have flagged them at any port of entry. After the meeting in Malaysia, the two men flew to Los Angeles, entering the United States legally. For the next year and a half, they lived openly in San Diego, California. They had driver's licenses, opened bank accounts, and even appeared in the phone book. They were, for all intents and purposes, sleeper agents hiding in plain sight. The FBI, which should have been tracking them, was never informed by the CIA that these known terrorists were inside the country. This was a colossal intelligence failure, a direct consequence of the walls between the agencies. The puzzle pieces were not just in different boxes, they were in different buildings, held by people who weren't allowed to talk to each other. While al-Mihdhar and al-Hazmi were settling in California, the other key members of the plot were making their way to America. The four men who would become the hijacker pilots, Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehai, Ziad Jarrah, and Hani Hanjur, began arriving in mid-2000. They enrolled in flight schools, primarily in Florida and Arizona. Their behavior was often suspicious. They were reportedly poor students, interested only in learning how to steer a plane, not how to take off or land. One flight instructor in Minnesota, alerted by their strange requests, would later recall his student, Zacharias Moussaoui, a man authorities now believe was intended to be the 20th hijacker. Moussaoui paid thousands in cash to learn how to fly a Boeing 747 simulator, but expressed no interest in getting a pilot's license. The instructor was so concerned that he contacted the local FBI field office. On August 16, 2001, FBI agents arrested Moussaoui on an immigration violation. The Minneapolis agents immediately recognized the danger. They sent an urgent request to FBI headquarters, seeking a warrant to search Moussaoui's laptop and belongings. They believed he was a terrorist who could fly a plane into the World Trade Center. The request was turned down by a supervisor at headquarters, who argued there was not enough evidence to meet the standard for a criminal warrant. It was another critical failure, a dot that wasn't connected. The Minneapolis agents were furious, feeling that bureaucracy was preventing them from stopping a potential attack. As the summer of 2001 wore on, the warnings grew more specific and more urgent. On July 10th, an FBI agent in the Phoenix field office sent a memo to headquarters. It was titled, Bin Laden and Associates Operating in the United States. The memo, which became known as the Phoenix Memo, noted an inordinate number of individuals of investigative interest enrolling in aviation universities in Arizona. The agent, Kenneth Williams, theorized that al-Qaeda might be sending students to the U.S. for flight training to conduct terrorist activity. He recommended a nationwide canvass of flight schools to look for more evidence. His warning was prescient. but it was never acted upon. The memo was buried in the bureaucracy of FBI headquarters, another piece of the puzzle left on the table. The most direct warning reached the very highest levels of government. On August 6, 2001, President George W. Bush, who was on vacation at his ranch in Crawford, Texas, received his daily intelligence briefing. The title of that day's President's Daily Brief, or PDB, was stark: Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. The document summarized intelligence pointing to al-Qaeda's long-standing desire to attack America. It mentioned the FBI's investigation into a possible cell in the U.S., and noted that the group had considered using airplanes as weapons. However, the briefing was largely historical, lacking specific, actionable intelligence about the when, where, and how of the impending attack. It was a strategic warning, not a tactical one. The administration would later state that while they were aware of the threat, they had no idea it would manifest as a coordinated suicide hijacking of such magnitude. They were preparing for a more conventional attack, like another embassy bombing but overseas. The idea of using commercial jets as weapons against domestic targets was still considered by many to be too far-fetched. In late August, the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but they remained unseen. The CIA finally learned that al-Mithdir and al-Hazmi were in the country. On August 23, they formally requested that the State Department add them to the watch list and asked the FBI to launch a manhunt to find them. By then it was too late. The two men, along with Hani Hanjour, had already purchased their tickets for American Airlines Flight 77. The other hijackers were also making their final preparations. They bought their tickets online, using their real names. They booked one-way flights. They conducted surveillance flights to understand airline security procedures. In the final days, Mohammed Atta's luggage, which did not make it onto Flight 11, was found to contain a 4-page handwritten document. It was a final prayer and instruction manual for the hijackers, a chilling insight into their mindset. It urged them to purify your heart and clean it from all earthly matters, to check your weapons, and to shout Allahu Akbar, because this strikes fear in the hearts of the non-believers. They were not criminals or soldiers in the traditional sense. They were martyrs on a divine mission, convinced that their horrific act would grant them entry into paradise. They moved through the final days with a calm, deadly purpose, their faith insulating them from any doubt or fear. On September 10th, the day before the attacks, the National Security Agency intercepted 2 messages from an al-Qaeda operative in Afghanistan. One read, "The match is about to begin." The other said, "Tomorrow is 0 hour." The messages were not translated until September 12th. The system was more than blinking red. It was screaming, but the sound was muffled by bureaucratic walls, by a failure of imagination, by a system designed to solve old problems while a new, unimaginable one was taking shape. The hijackers had exploited the seams in America's defenses. They had used the country's own freedoms, its open borders, its accessible flight schools, its interconnected transportation system, as weapons against it. As the sun set on September 10th, 19 men made their final prayers. They were scattered in hotel rooms in Boston, Newark, and the suburbs of Washington, D.C. They were anonymous, invisible, and perfectly positioned. The long, slow-burning fuse had reached the powder keg. All that remained was the dawn. Chapter 4. The Human Factor. In the grand sweep of history, events are often reduced to dates, statistics, and geopolitical consequences. But the story of September 11th is, at its core, a profoundly human one. It is a story of the 19 men who embraced a nihilistic ideology and the nearly 3,000 innocent people whose lives they extinguished. To understand the day, one must understand the people, both the perpetrators and the victims, whose paths were set on a collision course. The 19 hijackers were not a monolith. They came from different countries, different social classes, and had different temperaments, but they were united by a shared, fanatical devotion to Osama bin Laden's cause. The undisputed leader of the operation was Mohammed Atta. Born in Egypt to a middle-class family, Atta was a trained architect and urban planner. He was intensely serious, ascetic, and filled with a deep-seated anger at the West, which he believed was corrupting and humiliating the Islamic world. He had studied in Hamburg, Germany, where he became part of a radicalized cell of students that included 2 of the other pilots, Marwan el-Shehi and Ziad Jarrah. The Hamburg cell was the nucleus of the 9/11's plot. These were educated, multilingual men who had lived in the West and had seen its culture up close. Their hatred was not born of ignorance, but of a specific intellectual rejection of modernity and secularism. Atta was the perfect operational commander, meticulous, disciplined, and utterly ruthless. He handled the logistics, the money, and the communications, ensuring the plot stayed on track. Marwan el-Shehi, the pilot of United Flight 175, was from the United Arab Emirates. He was more jovial and outgoing than Atta, but shared his fanatical beliefs. Ziad Jarrah, the pilot of United Flight 93, was from a wealthy secular Lebanese family. He was in many ways the outlier. He had a Turkish girlfriend in Germany, enjoyed a more Western lifestyle, and reportedly had moments of doubt about the mission. His journey into extremism is a chilling testament to the power of indoctrination. The fourth pilot, Hani Hanjour, a Saudi, was different from the Hamburg group. He had spent years in the United States trying to become a commercial pilot, but was largely unsuccessful, described by his instructors as a terrible flyer. Yet his persistence eventually earned him a pilot's license, and his familiarity with the US made him a valuable asset. He would be assigned the most difficult target to hit the Pentagon. The other 15 hijackers were the muscle. All were from Saudi Arabia, with the exception of one from the UAE and one from Lebanon. They were mostly young, impressionable men, recruited for their loyalty and willingness to die. Their job was to storm the cockpit, control the passengers through force and intimidation, and ensure the pilots could carry out their mission. They were the disposable instruments of the plot. Their individual stories are less known, but they were the engine of the violence, the men who wielded the box cutters and created the terror that paralyzed the planes. On the other side of this equation were the men and women who boarded those 4 flights on the morning of September 11th. They were a cross-section of America. People like Daniel Lewin, an American-Israeli internet entrepreneur and former Special Forces soldier, who was sitting in seat 9B on Flight 11, directly in front of Mohammed Atta. It is believed that Lewin, trained in counter-terrorism, was the first person to try to stop the hijacking, and was likely the passenger in business class whose throat was slit, a brutal opening act to silence any resistance. There was Barbara Olson, a conservative television commentator and wife of the U.S. Solicitor General, who was on Flight 77. She managed to make 2 calls to her husband from the plane, providing the first crucial intelligence that the flight had been hijacked, and telling him about the men with knives and box cutters. Her calls provided a window into the terror, but also a portrait of immense courage. On United Flight 93, the passengers were a diverse group. There was Todd Beamer, an account manager for Oracle, a husband and father of 2, with a 3rd child on the way. There was Mark Bingham, a public relations executive and former college rugby star. There was Tom Burnett, a medical device company executive, and there was Jeremy Glick, a judo champion. These men, and many others on that flight, would become symbols of American defiance. The crews of the 4 planes were the first line of defense, and they paid the ultimate price. On Flight 11, Captain John Oganowski and his first officer Thomas McGinnis were the first to be killed. Flight attendants Betty Ong and Madeline Sweeney became heroes for their calm professional reporting of the hijacking, providing priceless information to the ground even as their own lives were ending. On Flight 77, Captain Charles Burlingame was a former Navy fighter pilot who had worked in the section of the Pentagon that his plane would later destroy. The sheer tragic irony of his fate is staggering. The people in the targeted buildings were just starting their day. At the World Trade Center, Cantor Fitzgerald, a financial services firm, occupied the 101st to 105th floors of the North Tower, directly in the path of Flight 11. Of the 960 employees in the office that morning, 658 were killed. They left behind hundreds of spouses and over 1,000 children. They vanished in an instant. The firm's CEO, Howard Lutnick, survived only because he was taking his son to his first day of kindergarten. His brother Gary was among those killed. In the South Tower, companies like Aon Corporation and Fuji Bank had offices high up. Their employees faced a different kind of horror. They witnessed the attack on the North Tower, and for 17 minutes, they were left to make an impossible choice. Some evacuated immediately. Others were told by the Port Authority to stay put, that their building was secure. That announcement, made with the best of intentions in a moment of utter confusion, would prove to be a death sentence for many. At the Pentagon, the attack struck the western side of the building, which had recently been renovated to strengthen it against terrorist attacks. The reinforcements saved many lives, but 125 people inside the building were still killed. They were military personnel and civilian employees, from generals to janitors, all serving their country. They were at their desks, in meetings, in the cafeteria, when their workplace became a war zone. The human factor also extends to the decision-makers on the ground. Ben Sileny, the FAA's National Operations Manager, was on his very first day in the job. With 2 planes having hit the towers and 2 more hijacked and unaccounted for, he made an unprecedented and audacious decision. With no protocol to guide him, he ordered every single civilian aircraft in United States airspace, over 4,500 planes, to land at the nearest airport immediately. It was a bold move that grounded the nation's entire air transportation system in a matter of hours, but it almost certainly prevented further attacks and saved countless lives. In a classroom in Sarasota, Florida, President George W. Bush was reading The Pet Goat to a group of second graders as part of an event to promote his education agenda. His chief of staff, Andrew Card, walked in and whispered in his ear, "A second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack." The moment was captured on camera. The president's face registered a brief flash of shock and confusion, before settling into a grim, determined mask. He remained seated for several minutes, a decision later criticized by some, but which he defended as a necessary act to project calm and avoid frightening the children. In that moment, his presidency was irrevocably transformed. He was no longer a domestic policy president. He was a wartime commander-in-chief. The story of 9/11 events is the story of these individuals, of Mohammed Atta's cold fury and Betty Ong's calm courage, of the fireman who charged up the stairs while civilians streamed down, of the office worker who had to choose which way to run, of the passenger who decided to fight back. It was a day when the worst of humanity collided with the best of humanity, when unimaginable evil was met with extraordinary bravery. The 19 hijackers succeeded in their mission of mass murder, but they failed to break the spirit of the people they targeted. In the crucible of that terrible morning, the human factor proved to be not a weakness, but a source of incredible resilience and strength. The choices made by individuals in the air and on the ground in the final minutes of their lives would shape the narrative of the day and define its legacy for generations to come. Chapter 5. The Impossible Choice. As the minutes ticked by after the first impact at 8:46 a.m., a state of profound confusion reigned. The event was so far outside the realm of experience that the initial response was defined by disbelief and a struggle to comprehend the scale of the unfolding catastrophe. For those on the ground and in the air, the next hour would be a relentless series of impossible choices, made in the dark, with incomplete information and unimaginable stakes. Inside the North Tower, above the impact zone, thousands of people were trapped. The plane had severed all 3 stairwells, leaving no path of escape. The elevators were destroyed. Smoke and jet fuel poured through the floors, creating an inferno that was rapidly consuming the available oxygen. For these men and women, the choices were stark and horrifying. They could stay and wait for a rescue that was never going to come, succumbing to the smoke and flames, or they could move toward the windows for fresh air, which led to the most harrowing and unforgettable images of the day. Faced with the choice between 2 certain deaths, one by fire, the other by gravity, an estimated 200 people chose to jump from the upper floors of the towers. It was not an act of suicide, but a desperate final attempt to escape an unbearable situation. Their decisions, made in the last moments of their lives, became a public spectacle of private agony, a symbol of the attack's unimaginable cruelty. Below the impact, a massive evacuation was underway. The building's emergency procedures, designed for a fire on a single floor, were wholly inadequate. Yet amidst the chaos, stories of courage and leadership emerged. Rick Rescorla, the head of security for Morgan Stanley in the South Tower, was a decorated Vietnam veteran. He had long been concerned about the tower's vulnerability. After the 1993 bombing, he had drilled his employees relentlessly, forcing them to practice evacuating down the stairs. When the first plane hit the North Tower, the Port Authority ordered people in the South Tower to remain at their desks. Rescorla ignored the order. Grabbing his bullhorn, he began systematically evacuating all 2,700 Morgan Stanley employees. He sang patriotic and Cornish folk songs to keep their spirits up as they descended the 99 flights of stairs. He made it out but went back in to search for stragglers. He was last seen on the 10th floor, heading up when the South Tower collapsed. He saved almost everyone in his company, at the cost of his own life. His decision to defy the official directive was a choice that saved thousands. In the air, the passengers and crew of the 3 remaining hijacked flights were facing their own impossible choices. On United Flight 175, which was bearing down on the South Tower, passengers were able to make phone calls to their loved ones. A businessman named Peter Hansen, traveling with his wife Sue and their 2.5-year-old daughter Christine, called his father. His words painted a terrifying picture. "It's getting bad, Dad." A stewardess was stabbed. "They seem to have knives and mace. They said they have a bomb. The plane is making jerky movements. I don't think the pilot is flying the plane. I think we are going down. I think they intend to go to Chicago or someplace and fly into a building. Don't worry, Dad. If it happens, it'll be very fast. My God, my God." The call cut out. At 9:03 a.m., 17 minutes after the first attack, Millions watching on live television saw Flight 175 bank sharply and plow into the southern face of the South Tower. The second impact erased any doubt that this was a coordinated terrorist attack. The sight of the second plane, a deliberate act of destruction witnessed in real time by the entire world, was a moment of collective trauma. America, and indeed the world, was now under attack. The decision-making process on the ground was now a frantic race against time. At the Northeast Air Defense Sector, or NADES, in Rome, New York, the military command responsible for protecting the eastern seaboard was scrambling to get fighter jets in the air. The problem was, they didn't know where to send them. The hijackers had turned off the plane's transponders, making them nearly impossible to track on radar. By the time two F-15 Sens were scrambled from Otis Air National Guard Base in Massachusetts, Flight 11 had already hit the North Tower. The fighters were sent out over the Atlantic on a patrol pattern, a standard procedure for a crisis over the ocean, not one unfolding over a major American city. The protocols in place were designed for a Cold War threat, Soviet bombers coming over the North Pole, not for commercial airliners being used as weapons from within. While the fighters were in the air, a new threat emerged. American Airlines Flight 77, the Boeing 757 out of Dulles, had also gone silent. It had taken off at 8:20 a.m. By 8:54, it had deviated from its flight path over Ohio and turned back toward Washington, D.C. For nearly 30 minutes, the plane flew eastward, completely undetected by the FAA or the military. It was a ghost plane, heading directly for the nation's capital. At the Pentagon, the National Military Command Center was the nerve center of the U.S. Armed Forces. Yet, they were as blind as everyone else. The news of the attacks in New York was on their television screens, but they had no tactical information about the new threat to Flight 77. The impossible choice now fell to the fighter pilots. With hijacked planes in the air, the question of whether to shoot down a civilian airliner had to be considered. Vice President Dick Cheney, who had been evacuated to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center beneath the White House, would later say he gave the order to engage. But the order was never relayed to the pilots in time. The chain of command was too slow, the situation too chaotic. The pilots themselves were unsure of their rules of engagement. Could they, and would they, shoot down a plane filled with American citizens to save a target on the ground? It was a choice no soldier ever wants to make. At 9:37 a.m., that choice became moot. Flight 77, piloted by Hani Hanjour, who had trained at a flight school just miles away, executed a difficult high-speed turn and slammed into the western side of the Pentagon. The attack on the very heart of the U.S. military was a staggering blow. The nation's capital was under attack. The White House, the Capitol, and all federal buildings were evacuated. The nation's leaders were being moved to secure undisclosed locations. It felt as if the government itself was collapsing. But there was one more plane. United Flight 93 had been delayed on the tarmac at Newark for over 40 minutes. This delay would prove to be crucial. Because of it, the passengers and crew on Flight 93 knew what the passengers on the other three flights did not. They knew about the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Through a series of over 30 airphone and cell phone calls, they learned that this was not a normal hijacking. They were on a suicide mission, part of a larger attack on America. This knowledge presented them with the ultimate impossible choice. They could remain passive and accept their fate, allowing the hijackers to hit their intended target, believed to be in Washington, D.C., or they could fight back, knowing that their actions would almost certainly lead to their own deaths, but could save the lives of countless others on the ground. Tom Burnett called his wife Dina 4 times. In his last call, he said, "I know we're all going to die. There's 3 of us who are going to do something about it. I love you, honey." Todd Beamer tried to call his family, but was routed to an GTE airphone operator, Lisa Jefferson. He calmly relayed information about the hijacking, and then asked Jefferson to recite the Lord's Prayer with him. After they finished, his last audible words were, "Are you guys ready? Okay, let's roll." The passengers and crew made their choice. They voted, and they decided to act. They were ordinary people who in the final moments of their lives chose to become soldiers. They stormed the cockpit. The cockpit voice recorder captured the sounds of the struggle, crashes, shouts, and the hijackers screaming in Arabic. The plane began to roll violently as the terrorists fought to maintain control. At 10:03 a.m., United Flight 93 crashed into an empty field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at over 560 miles per hour. It was just 20 minutes flying time from Washington, D.C. The passengers of Flight 93 had made the most difficult choice of all. They chose to sacrifice themselves to thwart the final stage of Al-Qaeda's plot. Theirs was the one act of successful counter-terrorism on a day of catastrophic failure. They had faced an impossible situation, and had responded not with fear, but with breathtaking courage. Their choice became one of the defining stories of September 11th, a ray of light in an otherwise unbearable darkness. Chapter 6. The Falling Sky. While the heroes of Flight 93 were making their final stand, the tragedy in New York City was entering its most horrific phase. The two towers, icons of the skyline, had been transformed into vertical tombs, burning furiously from within. For the first responders on the ground, the situation was unprecedented. The New York City Fire Department, the FDNY, initiated the largest rescue operation in its history. Thousands of firefighters, police officers, and paramedics converged on the site, a tide of bravery flowing toward a scene of unimaginable horror. The command structure was immediately compromised. The initial FDNY command post, set up in the lobby of the North Tower, was chaotic. Communications were failing. The firefighters' radios didn't work properly inside the steel and concrete canyons of the towers, a known problem that had never been fixed. This meant that the chiefs on the ground had little to no contact with the companies they had sent up into the buildings. They were sending their men into a black hole, with no way of knowing what they were facing or how structurally compromised the buildings were. Firefighters, laden with over 100 pounds of gear, began the arduous climb up the stairwells. Their mission was twofold: to rescue the civilians trapped above and to extinguish the fires. It was a task that was from the outset impossible. No fire department in the world was equipped to fight a massive, jet fuel-fed fire 80 or 90 stories in the air. The building's own sprinkler systems had been severed by the impacts. The firefighters could only go as far as their hoses and their legs would take them. As they ascended, they passed a flood of evacuees coming down. The stairwells were dark, crowded, and slick with water from the sprinklers. But the encounters were orderly, marked by a strange, surreal calm. The civilians moved aside to let the firefighters pass, offering words of encouragement. The firefighters, in turn, reassured them, telling them to keep moving. It was a portrait of grace under extreme pressure, two rivers of humanity flowing in opposite directions, one toward safety, the other toward certain danger. The chiefs on the ground, including Chief of Department Peter Gansey, First Deputy Commissioner William Feehan, and Battalion Chief Oreo Palmer, made the fateful decision to go up themselves to get a better sense of the situation. They were men leading from the front, a tradition deeply ingrained in the FDNY. Many of them would not survive. Oreo Palmer, a marathon runner known for his physical fitness, managed to reach the 78th floor sky lobby of the South Tower, the site of the impact. His radio transmissions are a chilling record of the conditions inside numerous 10 to 45s code ones he reported, using the code for fatalities. "We've got 2 isolated pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines." His voice was calm, professional, and tragically optimistic. He believed he was fighting a controllable fire, unaware that the core steel columns of the building around him had been heated to their failure point. The structural integrity of the towers was the great unknown. The initial impacts had been devastating, wiping out numerous support columns, but the true damage was being done by the fires. The thousands of gallons of burning jet fuel created temperatures of over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. This was not hot enough to melt steel, but it was more than hot enough to weaken it, causing it to lose its structural strength. The floors, which were supported by a system of lightweight steel trusses, began to sag. As they sagged, they pulled inward on the remaining perimeter columns, increasing the stress on them. The buildings were dying from the inside out, but this was invisible to those on the ground. Then, at 9:59 a.m., the unthinkable happened. The South Tower, which had been struck second but had suffered more severe structural damage, began to collapse. It took less than 10 seconds. From the top down, floor after floor pancaked upon itself in a horrifying, unstoppable cascade of steel, concrete, and glass. The sound was a deafening, visceral roar, a sound that would be seared into the memory of everyone who heard it. For those on the ground, it was as if the sky itself was falling. A colossal cloud of pulverized debris, concrete dust, asbestos, and human remains billowed out, swallowing lower Manhattan. The cloud was a pyroclastic flow, moving at hurricane speeds, turning day into night. It blotted out the sun, filled the streets, and choked the air. It was the end of the world in a microcosm. People ran for their lives, desperately seeking shelter in building lobbies and under vehicles. The collapse of the South Tower was a psychological breaking point. Until that moment, the towers, though wounded, were still standing. Their collapse seemed to defy the laws of physics and reason. It was an event of such magnitude that the human mind struggled to process it. Inside the North Tower, the firefighters and remaining civilians heard and felt the collapse of the sister building. The order was finally given to evacuate all personnel. But for many, it was too late. The communication failures meant that many of the firefighters ascending the stairs never received the order. They continued their climb, unaware that their own building was minutes away from the same fate. At 10:28 a.m., 29 minutes after its twin, the North Tower collapsed. The process was sickeningly familiar: a slight shudder, the antenna at the top sinking into the roofline, and then the complete symmetrical disintegration of the 110-story building into a mountain of rubble. The second collapse created another massive dust cloud, compounding the apocalyptic scene in Lower Manhattan. The iconic skyline of New York City, a symbol recognized the world over, had been permanently and violently altered. In place of the two titans of commerce, there was now a gaping void and a pillar of smoke that would be visible from space. The human cost of the collapses was staggering. 343 firefighters of the FDNY were killed, 23 officers of the New York City Police Department, and 37 officers of the Port Authority Police Department also perished. They died alongside the civilians they were trying to save. They were crushed, buried, and incinerated. The site, which would soon be known as Ground Zero, was a smoldering, toxic pile of debris several stories high. It was a graveyard. The collapse of the Twin Towers was not just a structural failure. It was the collapse of an era. It shattered America's sense of security and invulnerability. The nation had been attacked on its own soil in a way not seen since Pearl Harbor, and the symbols of its power had been turned to dust on live television. The falling sky over Manhattan was a visual metaphor for a world that had been knocked off its axis. The certainty and optimism of the post-Cold War era vanished in those clouds of dust. In their place came fear, anger, and a profound sense of vulnerability. The world that emerged from the rubble of Ground Zero would be a very different place. A world defined by new wars, new security measures, and a new ever-present awareness of the threat of catastrophic terrorism. The breaking point had been reached, and the consequences would radiate outward from this epicenter of destruction for years to come. Chapter 7. The Dust and the Silence. In the moments after the second collapse, an eerie, unnatural silence descended upon Lower Manhattan, punctuated only by the chirp of thousands of personal alert safety systems, the alarms worn by firefighters. Each chirp signified a firefighter who was motionless, likely dead or incapacitated, buried beneath the mountain of wreckage. The sound was a haunting chorus of the dead, a sonic testament to the scale of the loss. The world was now coated in a thick, gray, toxic dust. It covered every surface, transforming the familiar cityscape into a monochrome alien landscape. It was a surreal, snow-like blanket, composed of pulverized concrete, glass, asbestos, lead, and the vaporized remains of thousands of human beings. To breathe it was to inhale the very substance of the destroyed buildings and the people within them. Survivors emerged from the dust cloud like ghosts, their bodies caked in the gray powder, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. They stumbled through the debris-strewn streets, trying to make sense of a world that had become unrecognizable. This was the immediate aftermath, a period of raw shock and instinctual survival. The first responders who had survived the collapses were now trapped in a nightmare. Firefighter Kevin Shea was in the North Tower lobby when it came down. He was blown across the street and buried in debris, but miraculously survived. He awoke in a world of darkness and dust, surrounded by the bodies of his fallen comrades. The stories of survival were often arbitrary, a matter of being in the right place at the right time by a margin of seconds or feet. Two Port Authority police officers, Will Jimeno and John McLaughlin, were buried alive deep within the rubble when a freight elevator shaft they were near miraculously held, creating a small void. They would spend hours trapped in the darkness, severely injured, their story later becoming the basis for the film World Trade Center. Their rescue would be a small beacon of hope in a sea of despair. The response in these initial hours was chaotic and largely improvised. The city's emergency command center, located at 7 World Trade Center, had been evacuated and was itself on fire, on the verge of its own collapse, later that afternoon. The chain of command for the fire and police departments had been decapitated. The most senior leaders of the FDNY, including Chief Gansi and Commissioner Fian, were dead. The leadership fell to the surviving chiefs and officers, who had to restore order from chaos, account for their missing men, and begin the impossible task of searching for survivors. A massive maritime evacuation, larger than the one at Dunkirk in World War II, was initiated spontaneously. Coast Guard put out a broadcast calling all available boats to the shores of Lower Manhattan to rescue the hundreds of thousands of people now stranded on the island, with bridges and tunnels closed. A flotilla of Coast Guard vessels, ferries, private yachts, and tugboats responded, evacuating an estimated 500,000 people from Manhattan to New Jersey and Brooklyn. It was an act of civic heroism, a testament to the maritime spirit of the city. While New York was reeling, the rest of the country was in a state of suspended animation. With all flights grounded by Ben Salini's order, the skies fell silent. The familiar sight and sound of contrails and jet engines vanished, replaced by an unnerving quiet. For the first time in decades, the only aircraft in the sky were military fighter jets, flying combat air patrols over major cities. America was a fortress, sealed off from the world and from itself. President Bush, who had been moved from the Florida school to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, and then to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, the home of U.S. Strategic Command, was largely out of public view for most of the day. This decision, made by the Secret Service for his safety, created a leadership vacuum that was filled by news anchors and, most notably, by New York City's mayor, Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani, whose popularity had been waning, rose to the occasion. He was on the streets, covered in dust, holding press conferences and projecting an image of calm, resolute leadership. He became, for a time, America's mayor, the face of the city's grief and its defiance. His words that day resonated with a shocked nation. The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear. The global reaction was a mixture of horror, shock, and in some corners, celebration. Leaders around the world condemned the attacks and offered condolences. In London, the Queen ordered the playing of the Star-Spangled Banners during the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. In Paris, the newspaper Le Monde ran a headline that captured the global sentiment of solidarity. Nous sommes tous Américains, we are all Americans. But in scattered pockets of the Middle East, some celebrated in the streets, viewing the attacks as a justified blow against an arrogant superpower. These images, broadcast on American television, fueled a burgeoning sense of anger that would soon shape the nation's response. As night fell on September 11th, the scene at Ground Zero was hellish. The pile of debris, 1.8 million tons of it, was burning. Fires deep within the wreckage would continue to smolder for nearly 100 days. The heat was so intense that it warped the steel beams into grotesque, twisted shapes. The air was thick with a toxic, acrid smoke that smelled of burning plastic, metal, and death. Under powerful floodlights, the search for survivors began in earnest. It was a perilous and often heartbreaking task. The pile, as it came to be known, was unstable, a treacherous landscape of sharp metal and precarious voids. Rescue workers, who came to be known as diggers, formed bucket brigades, passing debris from hand to hand. They were driven by the hope of finding their trapped brothers and colleagues, but they found very few. The sheer force of the collapses had pulverized almost everything and everyone within the towers. When a body or a body part was found, a solemn ritual would take place. All work would stop. A flag would be draped over the remains and they would be carried out in a silent honor guard. In those first 24 hours, the raw shock began to give way to a profound collective grief. Makeshift memorials sprang up across the city and the country. The faces of the missing were photocopied onto flyers and plastered on walls, a gallery of lost souls. Each flyer told a story: a smiling father, a young woman on her first job, a firefighter posing with his engine company. They were a reminder that the victims were not a statistic but individuals, their lives and futures stolen in a moment of hate. The dust had settled, but the silence that remained was heavy with loss. The day had been a relentless assault on the senses. The roar of the planes, the explosions, the collapse, the sirens. But the enduring memory for many was the quiet that followed. A world without planes in the sky, a city without its towers, a nation holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The immediate chaos was over, but the age of consequences had just begun. Chapter 8. The day after. September 12, 2001, dawned on a changed America. The sky was still clear, but the innocence of the previous morning was gone forever. The nation awoke from a fitful sleep to a new reality, one defined by grief, fear, and a burning desire for justice. The full scope of the human loss was still unknown, but it was clear that the death toll was in the thousands, making it the deadliest foreign attack on American soil in history. The immediate aftermath was a period of national mourning and unity. Political divisions, so prominent in the contentious 2000 election, seemed to evaporate overnight. Democrats and Republicans stood together on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, singing "God Bless Americas" in a spontaneous and moving display of solidarity. American flags appeared on every porch, every car, every overpass. There was a powerful, palpable sense of shared identity and collective sorrow. People were kinder to each other. Strangers spoke on the street. In the face of an external threat, the nation had come together. At Ground Zero, the rescue and recovery effort continued under the official name The Pile. It was a city within a city, a 16-acre site of organized chaos. For months, ironworkers, crane operators, police officers, firefighters, and construction workers from across the country worked 24/7, cutting through the steel and removing the debris. The work was physically and emotionally grueling. The air was toxic, a cocktail of carcinogens that would later cause severe, often fatal, illnesses for thousands of first responders. The psychological toll was immense. The workers were uncovering not just wreckage, but the fragmented remains of their friends, colleagues, and fellow citizens. The site was treated as both a crime scene and a sacred burial ground. The search for survivors officially ended after a few days. The last person pulled alive from the rubble was found on the afternoon of September 12th. From then on, it was a recovery mission. The process of identifying the victims was painstaking. Of the 2,753 people killed at the World Trade Center, only a few hundred intact bodies were ever found. For most, all that remained were fragments. Forensic scientists at the city's medical examiner's office would spend the next decade working to identify victims through DNA, a monumental task that continues to this day. For thousands of families, there would be no body to bury, no final goodbye. President Bush, after returning to Washington on the evening of the 11th, addressed the nation from the Oval Office. He vowed that the United States would make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. This statement, which came to be known as the Bush Doctrine, laid the groundwork for the coming military response. On September 14th, the president visited Ground Zero. Standing on a pile of rubble with a bullhorn, surrounded by weary rescue workers, he delivered one of the most memorable speeches of his presidency. When one of the workers shouted that he couldn't hear him, the president replied, "I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." The crowd erupted in cheers. The moment crystallized the nation's mood, a mixture of grief and a demand for retribution. The investigation into the attacks, codenamed Pentagon's Twin Towers bombing investigation, was the largest in the history of the FBI. Within days, the identities of the 19 hijackers were confirmed. Their faces were broadcast around the world. The investigation quickly established a clear link to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, operating from their safe haven in Afghanistan, under the protection of the Taliban. The question was no longer who did it, but what the United States would do about it. The immediate aftermath also saw a darker side of the national mood. A wave of anger and suspicion was directed at Arab Americans and Muslims. Mosques were vandalized, and individuals were subjected to harassment, discrimination, and violence. The unity that defined the initial response was tragically marred by this backlash of prejudice. In the corridors of power, the government was moving quickly to reshape the nation's security apparatus. The concept of homeland security, previously a niche academic term, was now the central organizing principle of the U.S. government. On September 20th, in a powerful address to a joint session of Congress, President Bush officially declared a war on terror. He issued an ultimatum to the Taliban: hand over the terrorists, or you will share in their fate. The speech laid out a vision for a new kind of war, a global conflict against a diffuse network of enemies, with no clear battlefield and no foreseeable end. The economic consequences of the attacks were immediate and severe. The New York Stock Exchange remained closed for 4 days, the longest shutdown since the Great Depression. When it reopened on September 17th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average suffered its largest ever one-day point drop. The airline industry was devastated. Already struggling financially, the attacks pushed major carriers to the brink of bankruptcy. Fear of flying gripped the public, and air travel would take years to recover. The financial heart of New York had been literally and figuratively shattered. For the families of the victims, the days and weeks after September 11th were a blur of grief and bureaucracy. They navigated a landscape of victim assistance centers, DNA collection, and memorial services. Organizations like the Red Cross were overwhelmed with donations and volunteers. The stories of the lost began to emerge, painting a mosaic of the lives that had been cut short. There was the story of the O'Neill brothers, one a firefighter, the other a police officer, who both rushed to the scene and both died. There was the story of the passengers on Flight 93, who had become national heroes. And there were the thousands of quieter stories of office workers and janitors, of visitors and delivery people, each leaving behind a shattered family and a community in mourning. The immediate aftermath was a time of profound contradiction. It was a time of immense unity and of rising prejudice. It was a time of deep sorrow and of growing anger. It was a time when ordinary people became heroes, and a nation stripped of its sense of security began to gird itself for a long and uncertain conflict. The fires at Ground Zero were still burning, but the embers of a new global war had already been ignited. The world of September 10th was gone, and the shape of the new world, forged in the crucible of the day after, was just beginning to emerge. Chapter 9. The Age of Consequences. The attacks of September 11th did not just destroy buildings and lives. they fundamentally reordered American society and its relationship with the world. The long-term consequences of that single day's events radiated outward for years, shaping the politics, culture, and daily life of the 21st century in ways that are still being felt. The most immediate and dramatic consequence was the War on Terror. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the attacks, the United States, with a coalition of international allies, launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The invasion of Afghanistan began with airstrikes against Taliban and Al-Qaeda targets. The initial military campaign was swift and successful. By December, the Taliban regime had been overthrown, and the Al-Qaeda training camps were destroyed. However, Osama bin Laden and other key Al-Qaeda leaders managed to escape into the rugged tribal areas of neighboring Pakistan, setting the stage for a protracted and frustrating manhunt that would last for nearly a decade. The war in Afghanistan, initially a mission to dismantle Al-Qaeda and punish the Taliban, evolved into a long-term nation-building project and a grueling counter-insurgency campaign. It would become the longest war in American history, spanning 2 decades, costing trillions of dollars, and claiming the lives of thousands of American soldiers and tens of thousands of Afghan civilians. The War on Terror soon expanded to a second front. The Bush administration, driven by a neoconservative ideology and a belief that the status quo in the Middle East had enabled the rise of extremism, turned its attention to Iraq, arguing that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and had ties to terrorist groups, claims that would later be proven false. The U.S. led an invasion of Iraq in March 2003. The removal of Saddam Hussein was accomplished quickly, but the aftermath was a disaster. The invasion destabilized the region, unleashed a bloody sectarian civil war, and created a power vacuum that was filled by extremist groups, including a new and even more brutal organization that would eventually call itself the Islamic State, or ISIS. The war in Iraq proved to be immensely divisive, both at home and abroad, straining alliances and costing the United States significant international credibility. Domestically, the 9/11 attacks ushered in the most significant reorganization of the U.S. government since World War II. In 2002, the Department of Homeland Security was created, merging 22 different federal agencies into a single, massive bureaucracy tasked with protecting the nation from terrorism. The walls between the CIA and the FBI was torn down, and a new Director of National Intelligence was created to oversee all 17 U.S. intelligence agencies and foster better information sharing. The changes were sweeping, but they also created new layers of bureaucracy and questions about oversight and effectiveness. Perhaps the most controversial domestic consequence was the passage of the USA Patriot Act in October 2001. Rushed through Congress in the fearful atmosphere following the attacks, the act gave the government broad new powers of surveillance, allowing for the collection of telephone and internet data, the use of roving wiretaps, and the monitoring of financial transactions, all with reduced judicial oversight. Proponents argued these tools were essential to prevent another attack. Critics warned that the act was a dangerous infringement on civil liberties and privacy, a debate that would intensify years later with the revelations of mass surveillance programs by whistleblowers like Edward Snowden. The experience of air travel was transformed forever. The Transportation Security Administration, or TSA, was created, federalizing airport security. The new procedures, taking off shoes, removing laptops, limits on liquids, and full-body scanners, became a routine and often frustrating part of modern life. Cockpit doors were reinforced and locked. The era of casually walking a loved one to the gate was over. The friendly skies had become a space of suspicion and security theater, a permanent reminder of the day that planes were turned into weapons. The attacks also had a profound and lasting impact on American culture. A new genre of film and television emerged, grappling with themes of terrorism, surveillance, and national security. Shows like 24 and films like Zero Dark 30 reflected and shaped the public's understanding of the War on Terror. But the cultural impact also had a darker side. Islamophobia became more mainstream. The perception of Muslims shifted from a diverse religious group to a monolithic and suspect community. This had a devastating impact on the lives of millions of Muslim Americans, who found themselves living under a cloud of suspicion in their own country. The financial cost of the post-9/11 era was staggering. The direct costs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, combined with increased spending on homeland security and veterans' care, would eventually run into the trillions of dollars. This massive expenditure contributed to a ballooning national debt and diverted resources that could have been used for domestic priorities, like healthcare, infrastructure, and education. The long-term health consequences for the first responders and recovery workers at Ground Zero became a national tragedy in its own right. Thousands of people who worked on the pile were exposed to a toxic brew of contaminants. In the years that followed, they began to suffer from a host of debilitating and often fatal illnesses, including rare cancers and respiratory diseases. Their fight for recognition and healthcare benefits from the government became a long and painful struggle, a testament to the enduring physical cost of the attacks. The Age of Consequences was an era of paradoxes. It was a time of heightened patriotism and of deep national division. It was an era where the pursuit of security led to a profound debate over the meaning of liberty. The quest to eliminate a foreign threat led to two long and costly wars that destabilized an entire region, and in some ways created new and more dangerous enemies. The attacks of September 11th were a single day's event, but their shockwaves created a new and more complex world. The sense of American invulnerability was shattered, replaced by a permanent state of vigilance. The post-Cold War holiday from history was over. The 21st century had truly begun, not with a celebration, but with a scar on the sky and a series of consequences that would define a generation. Chapter 10. The Scars and the Steel. More than 2 decades have passed since the morning of September 11th, 2001. A generation has now been born with no memory of a world with the Twin Towers, no recollection of a time before the TSA, before the War on Terror. The day has receded from current events into the annals of history, yet its legacy endures, etched into the nation's psyche and physically memorialized in the places where the attacks occurred. The physical scars of that day have been transformed. At Ground Zero in New York, the smoldering pile of debris has given way to a place of remembrance and rebirth. The National September 11th Memorial Museum now occupies the site. At its heart are 2 enormous reflecting pools, set within the exact footprints of the Twin Towers. Water cascades down their sides into a central abyss, a powerful symbol of absence and loss. The names of every victim from the 2001 and 1993 attacks are inscribed in bronze around the perimeters of the pools. It is a place of profound quiet and contemplation in the heart of a bustling city. Rising above the memorial is a new skyline dominated by the gleaming One World Trade Center, also known as the Freedom Tower. Standing at a symbolic 1,776 feet, it is a statement of defiance and resilience, a testament to the city's ability to rebuild. The new complex, with its office towers, transportation hub, and performing arts center, is a fusion of commerce and remembrance, a daily reminder of both what was lost and what has endured. In Arlington, Virginia, the Pentagon Memorial honors the 184 lives lost there. A series of 184 illuminated benches, each bearing a victim's name, are arranged in a timeline of their ages. The benches for the 59 passengers on Flight 77 face the sky, while those for the 125 victims inside the building face the Pentagon. It is a quiet, contemplative space, a stark contrast to the massive military bureaucracy it memorializes. In a quiet field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the Flight 93 National Memorial stands as a tribute to the 40 passengers and crew who gave their lives to prevent a greater catastrophe. A long black granite walkway marks the flight's final path. The Tower of Voices, a 93-foot-tall musical instrument holding 40 wind chimes, one for each victim, offers a perpetual, haunting tribute. The site is a testament to the power of ordinary people to act with extraordinary courage in the face of evil. The hunt for the architect of the attacks, Osama bin Laden, finally came to an end on May 2, 2011. In a daring late-night raid on a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, U.S. Navy SEALs killed the al-Qaeda leader. The news was met with jubilant celebrations across the United States. It was a moment of catharsis, a sense of justice delivered after a decade-long pursuit. But it did not end the war he started. The ideologies he espoused continued to inspire new generations of extremists, and the conflicts he ignited continued to smolder. The legacy of 9/11s is also a story of the survivors and the families of the victims. They have carried the burden of grief for decades, becoming advocates for remembrance, for national security reform, and for the healthcare of first responders. Their personal stories are the living history of the attacks, a permanent reminder of the human cost of terrorism. They have ensured that the victims are remembered not as a number, but as individuals with names, faces, and stories. The political and social legacy of the day remains complex and contested. The unity of the immediate aftermath has long since faded, replaced by deep political polarization. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan ended not with clear victories, but with messy, controversial withdrawals, leaving behind unstable regions and profound questions about the efficacy and morality of the 2-decade-long war on terror. The debate over the balance between security and liberty, ignited by the Patriot Act, continues to be a central tension in American life. The surveillance state that was built to prevent another 9/11s is now a permanent feature of the modern world, its reach and implications still not fully understood. September 11th was a day of endings. It was the end of an era of perceived American invulnerability. It was the end of nearly 3,000 lives. It was the end of a skyline, but it was also a day of beginnings. It was the beginning of new wars, new security measures, and new fears. It was the beginning of a long and difficult conversation about America's role in the world and the nature of freedom in an age of terror. The story of 9/11s is ultimately a story of scars and steel. The scars are the human losses, the lingering grief, the political divisions, and the unresolved traumas that the day inflicted upon the nation. They are a permanent part of the American story. But the steel is the resilience of the human spirit, the courage of the first responders, the defiance of the passengers on Flight 93, and the determination to rebuild, not just with new towers of glass and steel, but with a renewed commitment to the ideals that were targeted on that clear blue morning. The day will never be forgotten, for its legacy is not just in the memorials of stone and water, but in the very fabric of the world we inhabit today. It was the day the 21st century began in earnest, a day that changed America and the world forever.